Right, so if you've ended up here at a reasonable hour with a cup of tea and a free evening, then hello, welcome, glad to have you. But if you're watching this at 1:30 in the morning, propped up on one elbow, screen brightness turned down to the absolute lowest setting your phone allows, one earbud in because the other one's somewhere in the bed sheets, and you can't be bothered to look for it, then honestly, that's more like it. That's who this is for, you're in the right place. Here's what we're doing tonight. We're going through every single post-credit scene in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of them, in order, start to finish, and we're doing it slowly, the way you talk about something with a friend who's already half asleep and just wants to keep hearing your voice rattle on about a thing you clearly care about more than is strictly reasonable. I want to talk for a second about why these scenes are such a lovely thing to go through end to end, because I think it's easy to forget how strange they actually are. For most of film history, when the movie ended, it ended. The credits rolled, the lights came up, everyone shuffled out, stepping on each other's popcorn. And then Marvel comes along and quietly trains an entire generation of cinemagoers to just not leave. To sit there in the dark, through the gaffers and the best boys, and the names of 40 visual effects houses, all on the promise that there might be 30 seconds of something at the very end. And usually there was. Sometimes it was a tease for the next film. Sometimes it was a joke. Sometimes it was a single shot that completely changed how you understood everything you just watched. And the genius of it, the thing I find genuinely clever about the whole approach, is that they turn the most boring part of the movie-going experience, the bit everyone used to skip, into the parts you couldn't afford to miss. And when you line them all up, which is what we're going to do, you get this odd little second story running alongside the main one. A story told entirely in fragments, 30 seconds here, a minute there. Nick Fury in the shadows of a mansion. A man turning around in the dark and smiling. A team eating in silence in a half-destroyed restaurant. A pager. A duck. It's the universe being assembled in real time, right in front of you, one breadcrumb at a time. And watching it happen in sequence is sort of like flipping through someone's old planner and seeing all the little notes they left themselves about what was coming. A few gentle ground rules before we settle in. We're going in MCU timeline order, the order these scenes really happened, because that's the order they were meant to be discovered, and it's the order where the little handoffs between films make the most sense. Some scenes are going to get a bit more room than others, because some of them truly deserve it, and some of them are a raccoon licking someone's face. And there are a couple of films, a couple of fairly big ones actually, that famously have no post-credit scene at all, and we'll get to those, because the absence is sometimes as interesting as the scene. If this is the sort of thing you like having on, long and unhurried and slightly nerdy, there's a subscribe button floating around somewhere on this screen, and I make a lot of these. No pressure at all. It'll keep for later. For now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's go back to the very beginning, to a desert and a mansion, and a man in a long coat who broke in and decided to wait in the dark. Let's start where it all started, which is a man sitting alone in the dark in another man's house, which when you say it out loud sounds vaguely threatening, and really, it is meant to. It's 2008. Iron Man has just come out, and it's a hit, which at the time was not a foregone conclusion, because the studio had essentially bet the company on a B-list character played by an actor most of Hollywood had spent years being nervous about. The film ends with Tony Stark doing something no superhero had really done before, which is standing at a press conference and just telling everyone, no secret identity, no careful cover story, I am Iron Man. And that's the end. That's where the film closes. And then the credits roll and most of the audience gets up to leave. The ones who stayed got this. Tony comes home to his Malibu mansion, and there's someone already inside. A man in a long black coat standing in the shadows, who introduces himself as Nick Fury of an organisation called S.H.I.E.L.D. And Fury says he's there to talk about something called the Avenger Initiative. And that's it. That's the whole scene. A handshake, a name, an idea. There was no plan at the time for any of this to become what it became. Not really, not in any locked down way, but there's the seed of it, dropped quietly into the dark at the end of a film about a man in a metal suit. Here's a fun detail I always come back to. The actor playing Fury, Samuel L. Jackson, reportedly shot that entire cameo in a remarkably short stretch of time. A tiny bit of work for a tiny scene that ended up being the literal foundation stone of one of the biggest film projects ever attempted. There's something I find quite charming about that. The most important 30 seconds in the whole enterprise banged out almost as an afterthought. Now, the same year, a few months later, there was another Marvel film, The Incredible Hulk, and this one's a bit of an odd duck in the catalogue. It tends to get forgotten, partly because the lead actor was later recast, and partly because it just sits slightly off to the side of everything else. Its little extra scene is actually a slightly different animal. It's not after the credits, it's a tag right at the end of the story proper. Tony Stark walks into a bar where General Ross, the man who'd spent the whole film chasing the Hulk, is drinking alone and looking thoroughly defeated. And Tony, all swagger, tells him that a team is being put together. That's the connective tissue. That's the moment the Hulk film reaches out and links hands with the Iron Man film. It's a small thing, but it's the first time the universe really winks at you and says these are all happening in the same place. Then 2010, Iron Man 2. The film itself is a slightly messy affair, but its stinger is lovely and simple. Throughout the movie, Agent Coulson, who by this point we'd come to know as the unflappable shield man who follows Tony around, gets pulled off Stark duty and sent to New Mexico for something more important. And in the scene after the credits, we find out what. He's standing at the edge of a crater in the middle of the desert, and at the bottom of it, half buried in the sand and surrounded by hastily erected barriers, is a hammer. Just a hammer. Coulson looks at it and quietly reports back that they found it. And if you knew your Norse mythology, or you'd read the trade magazines, you knew exactly whose hammer that was. The next film was going to be about a god. The desert was the handoff, which brings us neatly to Thor 2011. By now, the post-credit scene is becoming a proper habit, an expected part of the deal, and Thor's is a good one. Nick Fury, back again, brings Dr. Eric Selvig, a scientist we'd met during the film, into a shield facility, and he shows him a glowing blue cube locked in a case and asks him to study it. Tells him it could be a source of unlimited energy, the kind of thing that could change everything for humanity. Selvig agrees, says something like, "I guess that's worth a look." And then the camera drifts, and we see Loki, who we'd watched fall into the void at the end of the film, presumed gone. He's standing just behind Selvig, reflected, lurking, and it becomes very clear that Selvig isn't entirely speaking for himself anymore. That blue cube, by the way, is the Tesseract, and it's going to matter enormously. This is the first time we really see it, sitting in a box, waiting to cause about a decade of trouble. And rounding out this first stretch, also 2011, Captain America, the first Avenger. Steve Rogers has just woken up after 70 years in the ice, stumbled out into a present-day New York that bears no resemblance to the one he left. And in the scene after the credits, Nick Fury, who is by now basically the universe's recurring doorman, approaches him in a gym about a mission. One that matters. And the scene folds straight into a teaser for the film everyone had been waiting years for. Because all of this, the mansion, the desert, the cube, the man out of time, all of it had been pointing at one thing. They were finally going to put them all in a room together. So they put them all in a room together. And the film was The Avengers, 2012. And it worked. It really worked. And it ends with 2 scenes after the credits. And the pairing of them tells you almost everything about why these stingers became such a beloved part of the whole thing, because the 2 of them could not be more different in tone, and both of them land. The first one is quiet and ominous. We're somewhere out in space, somewhere dark and cavernous, and a hooded figure we'd glimpsed during the film, an alien intermediary, is reporting back to his master. He's nervous. He's explaining that this little invasion of Earth didn't go to plan, that the humans are more trouble than expected, that to go after them again would be, in his words, to court death. And his master, who's been sitting on a sort of floating throne with his back to us this whole time, turns around, and it's a big purple fellow with a heavy jaw, and when he hears the word death, he smiles. That's it. He just smiles slowly, and the scene ends. Most of the audience had no idea who he was. This was Thanos, and he had just been introduced with no name, no dialogue, nothing but a grin in the dark. And the really patient thing about it, the bit I find almost cheeky in hindsight, is that they then made you wait years to find out what that grin meant. He doesn't properly show up again. For ages, they planted him and then just let him sit there, in the back of your mind, smiling. And then the second scene, which is the complete opposite, and is one of my favourite things in the entire run of these. After all the destruction, the alien army, the near-nuclear catastrophe over Manhattan, we cut to the team sitting in a half-wrecked restaurant, eating, in total silence. They're exhausted, battered, slumped in their seats, slowly chewing. Nobody says a word. It's just 6 of the most powerful beings on the planet, who've just saved the world, too knackered to talk, having a quiet meal together. The food is shawarma, which earlier in the film one of them had mentioned wanting to try, and it's funny precisely because nothing happens. There's no joke as such, it's just the deflation after the adrenaline, the very human come down, played completely straight. Here's the fun detail. That scene, the shawarma scene, was reportedly shot after the film had already premiered. They went back and filmed it late, squeezed it in, and the cast all looked slightly different because of it, because some of them had moved on to other things and their hair and weight had changed in the interim. There's one actor in particular who's barely in it, mostly hidden, because he wasn't really available, and none of that matters at all when you're watching it. It just feels like the perfect, knackered full stop on the whole adventure. So you've got these 2 scenes back to back, one whispering, something enormous is coming, the other shrugging, but for now, let's just eat. And that contrast, the dread and the comedy sitting right next to each other, that became the template. That became the thing Marvel would do over and over for the next decade and more. They figured out right here that the scene after the credits could be a threat or a punchline, and that you'd happily sit through 10 minutes of names to find out which one you were getting tonight. Now let's talk a little about the next stretch, which the studio called Phase 2, and which is where these scenes start doing some quiet heavy lifting, because up to now, they've mostly been about introducing people. Going forward, they start being about objects, specifically about 6 particular objects that are going to drive the entire story for years. But not every scene in this stretch is cosmic and weighty, and I rather love that the run kicks off with one of the gentlest, daftest ones in the whole catalogue. Iron Man 3 2013. The whole film, it turns out, has been Tony Stark recounting the story to someone. And in the scene after the credits, we find out who. He's been telling the entire tale to Bruce Banner, the Hulk, who is sitting next to him on a couch. And Bruce has fallen asleep. Not just dozed off at the sad bit, but apparently nodded off almost the moment Tony started talking, and has been gently snoozing through the whole thing. Tony, mildly affronted, points out that Bruce is a terrible therapist, that he isn't that kind of doctor and never claimed to be, and then, out of what I can only describe as pure spite, immediately launches into another long story about a wound from his childhood, jolting Bruce awake to endure more. It's a lovely little scene, and I bring it up partly because, well, given what we're doing here, a post-credit scene about someone peacefully falling asleep while a friend talks at length feels almost too on the nose. No notes, we're all Bruce tonight. Then Thor. The Dark World, also 2013, and this one has 2 scenes, and the first is genuinely important. 2 of Thor's Asgardian companions travel to a strange, cluttered lair to hand over a dangerous red substance, the ether, that had caused all the trouble in the film. They're giving it to a flamboyant collector type, because as one of them explains, the Asgardians already have the Tesseract locked away, and it isn't wise to keep two of these things in the same place. And that's the line that matters, because it's the first time the films come right out and tell you these scattered powerful artifacts are the same kind of thing. They're Infinity Stones. There are 6 of them. After the Asgardians leave, the Collector looks at his new acquisition and murmurs, "1 down, 5 to go." Which, when you first heard it, was a quiet little thrill. The film handing you the shape of the whole future, the whole long hunt to come, in 5 short words. The second scene is much softer, just Thor returning to Earth and reuniting with Jane, the scientist he loves, with one of the film's monsters left forgotten in a lab, frolicking happily around London. A nice warm full stop. Captain America, The Winter Soldier 2014 also gives us 2. The first takes us inside a Hydra facility, where a sinister Baron type is revealed to have got his hands on Loki's old scepter from the Avengers. He talks about how they'll keep the heroes distracted by feeding them little victories, and then he shows off 2 test subjects, the only survivors of his experiments, a young man and a young woman. The young man blurs around his cell at impossible speed. The young woman lifts and moves objects with her mind, and stacks of wooden blocks tumble and rebuild at her gesture. These are the Maximoff twins, and this is our first glimpse of them. The second scene is quieter and sadder. Bucky Barnes, Steve's lost friend, turned brainwashed assassin, who'd had a flicker of recognition during the film, is standing in a museum, looking at an exhibit about himself, his own memorial, reading about who he used to be, trying to find the man under the conditioning. It's a small melancholy thing, and it sets up a journey back to himself that takes years to complete. And then Guardians of the Galaxy 2014, which threw the doors open on the cosmic side of things and gave us, after the credits, a duck. The Collector, last seen acquiring that red stone, is now sitting in the ruins of his museum, which got rather comprehensively destroyed during the film. And among the wreckage, a space dog called Cosmo wanders over and licks his face, and then from off to the side, a small irritated voice complains about how gross that is, and we see it's a talking duck, sipping a drink, thoroughly unimpressed with everyone. This is Howard the Duck. Here's the fun fact for that one. Howard has a really strange history as a character, including a notoriously troubled film from decades earlier that's become a bit of a punchline in its own right. So, sticking him in the corner of this scene, sipping his drink and judging a space dog, was the studio quietly digging up a very old, very odd piece of the catalogue and giving it a wink. Most people had no idea who he was. The people who did absolutely lost their minds. Avengers. Age of Ultron 2015 keeps it brief and pointed. We cut to a vault somewhere cosmic, and Thanos, that big purple fellow from the Grin in the Dark, is back. He's grown tired of using middlemen. 2 of his agents have now failed to bring him the stones he wanted, and he's clearly done waiting on other people. He reaches into the vault and pulls out a golden gauntlet, slips it onto his hand and says, more or less, that if you want something done properly, you'll have to do it yourself. It's a threat and a promise. The patient man in the chair has decided to get up. And to close out this stretch, Ant-Man, also 2015, with 2 scenes. The first has Hank Pym, the original man behind the shrinking technology, leading his daughter Hope into a hidden room and revealing a prototype suit, a sleek thing built for a female wearer that he and his late wife had been working on years ago. Hope looks at it and looks at her father and says with enormous dry satisfaction, "It's about damn time." The second scene is a little excerpt that would later turn up, expanded in the next Captain America film. Steve Rogers and Sam Wilson have got Bucky restrained somewhere, his arm trapped in a vice, and they're trying to work out what to do because the political situation means they can't just call Tony for help. Steve reckons they're on their own, and Sam says, well, maybe not, he might know a guy, referring of course to the man whose own film you just watched, the universe stitching itself together again, one quiet, I know a guy at a time. And that brings us to Phase 3, which is where things get busier and where the post-credit scenes start coming in pairs almost as a rule. and occasionally, as we'll see, in absolutely ridiculous quantities. This is the stretch where the universe is at its most crowded and confident, and the scenes after the credits reflect that. Lots of doors being opened, lots of guys being introduced who'd matter later. Captain America, Civil War, 2016. The film tears the team apart over a question of accountability and ends on a genuinely fractured note. So the two scenes after are about where the broken pieces land. The first takes us to a lab where Bucky, with his consent, is being eased into a cryogenic freeze, going back on ice so that the conditioning in his head can be safely unpicked while he sleeps. Steve is there, and he warns the man who's offered Bucky sanctuary that the authorities will come looking once they realise where he is. And this man, calm as anything, looks out over a vast green landscape and says simply, "Let them try." And the camera pulls back to reveal gleaming towers and impossible technology, and you realise this isn't some quiet backwater at all. This is Wakanda, the most advanced nation on the planet, hiding in plain sight. The second scene is much lighter and is about a teenager. Peter Parker, fresh from his big outing in the film, is at home giving his Aunt May a wobbly excuse about a black eye, and then he sits down and starts fiddling with the suit Tony gave him. A red light begins blinking. He points it at the ceiling, and it projects a great glowing spider symbol, packed with little icons and functions he didn't know he had. A kid discovering his new toy has secret features. A gentle little tee-up for his own film. Doctor Strange, 2016, opened a whole new corner of the universe, the magic side, and its two scenes do two very different jobs. The first is almost pure comedy and almost pure setup at the same time. Strange is sitting in his sanctum, and across from him sits Thor, who has come to Earth looking for his missing father and has brought his troublesome brother along. Strange, not thrilled about a known menace wandering around, pours an endlessly refilling tankard of beer for Thor while they sort out an arrangement to help find the old man, and crucially, get the pair of them off Earth promptly. It's charming, and a longer version turns up later in Thor's next film. The second scene is the opposite of charming. Strange's former mentor figure, Mordo, who'd grown disillusioned during the film, corners a man we'd met earlier, a man who uses magic to walk, despite a spinal injury, and simply drains the magic out of him, leaving him collapsed and unable to move. And Mordo says coldly that the world has too many sorcerers, a statement of intent. Here's a thing I find truly funny in hindsight. That thread, Mordo turning villain, hung there for years and years, and the film that was meant to pay it off went in a completely different direction. So a lot of fans are still, to this day, gently wondering whatever happened to that plan. Not every breadcrumb leads somewhere. Sometimes the trail just goes cold, and everyone politely agrees not to mention it. Now, Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 2, 2017. Buckle in because this one has five scenes after the credits, which is, as far as I know, the record, and it's done partly as a joke about the very convention we're discussing. The first has Yondu's old first mate Kraglin trying to master the late captain's whistle-controlled flying arrow, and immediately, catastrophically, failing, sending it whizzing off and impaling poor Drax in the background, who yelps off screen. The second is sweeter, a reunion of grizzled old space pirates honouring a fallen friend, a group that comics readers recognised as a nod to a much older version of the Guardians lineup. The third introduces a golden, imperious alien priestess who has, out of spite, created a new artificial being in a birthing pod, a perfect creature she intends to use for revenge, and she names him Adam. The fourth jumps forward in time to show Groot the walking tree, now a sulky teenager refusing to tidy his room, while Quill nags at him like a tired dad. And the fifth and final one is the gentlest meta-joke imaginable, a group of cosmic observer beings growing visibly bored as an old man, played by the legendary comics creator who cameoed in nearly all these films, natters on at them about his adventures. They wander off, leaving him stranded because it turns out they were his ride. 5 scenes, most of them jokes, It's the film cheerfully taking the mick out of the idea that you have to stay for every single one, while making absolutely sure you do. Spider-Man: Homecoming, also 2017, brings it back down to one good scene. The film's villain, Toomes, is now in prison, and he's approached by another criminal, a man with a fresh scar on his face who bought weapons from him earlier. This man has heard a rumour that Toomes knows the true identity of Spider-Man, and asks with menace whether it's true. And Toomes, who by this point in the story has his own quiet reasons to protect the boy, looks him dead in the eye and lies. Says he hasn't got a clue who's under the mask. It's a small moment of grace from a villain and a tease of trouble to come. I'll also mention, because it's a fan favourite, that this film famously ends on a cheeky gag where Captain America himself appears in a little public service style clip to deliver a lecture straight to camera about the value of patience, gently mocking everyone who just sat through the entire credits expecting something enormous. It's the studio trolling its own audience, and it's perfect. And to close this opening stretch of Phase 3, Thor Ragnarok 2017. Two scenes. The first is heavy with dread. Thor and Loki, having narrowly escaped the destruction of their home, are aboard a refugee ship full of survivors, and Loki is musing about whether returning to Earth is really such a good idea for him personally, given his history there. And as they talk, an immense shadow falls across the ship. An enormous vessel pulls alongside them, dwarfing their own, and the scene cuts to black. That ship belongs to Thanos. Their escape has sailed them directly into the path of the very thing everyone had been dreading since that grin in the dark years earlier. The second scene is a palate cleanser, a quick gag with the Grandmaster, the eccentric ruler who'd been overthrown by his own people, trying to talk his way out of trouble with an angry mob by insisting that the revolution is technically a tie. The dread and the joke side by side, one last time before everything got very serious indeed. And now we come to the heavy part of the story, the stretch where everything the post-credit scenes had been quietly building toward finally arrives. The grin in the dark, the gauntlets pulled from the vault, the giant ship pulling alongside. All of it was pointing here. And what I find interesting is how the scenes in this stretch handle it, because they range from genuinely devastating to really silly, sometimes within the same film, and then it all ends on something I still think is one of the boldest choices in the whole run. Black Panther 2018 comes first, and it's a film about a hidden nation finally deciding whether to step out of the shadows. Its two scenes are about exactly that choice. In the first, the king stands before a gathering of world leaders and announces that his country, long believed to be a poor and simple place, is going to start sharing what it really has with the rest of the world. One of the diplomats, faintly condescending, asks what a nation of farmers could possibly offer anyone, and the king just smiles, a knowing little smile, because he's about to upend everything the world assumes about his home. The second scene is quieter and ties off a long-running thread. Bucky, that lost friend we keep returning to, is now out of the ice, recovering in a peaceful Wakandan village, sitting in the sun, looking calmer than we've ever seen him. Some local children call him the White Wolf. He's healing. After everything, he's finally getting a bit of peace, which, given how much this poor man had been put through across the films, felt thoroughly earned. Because next is Avengers: Infinity War 2018, and this film does something the others hadn't dared. It lets the villain win, and so it has only one scene after the credits, and it's not a tease for a fun adventure, it's the aftermath of a catastrophe. We're on a city street, and Nick Fury and his colleague Maria Hill are driving along when things start going very wrong around them. People are vanishing, crumbling into ash and blowing away on the wind. A car with no driver careens past, and Fury, realizing with horror what's happening, scrambles to dig an old device out of his bag, a modified pager, and manages to trigger it just as he himself begins to disintegrate, his last act before he turns to dust. The pager finishes its signal, lying on the pavement, and its little screen lights up with a symbol, a red and blue and gold emblem none of us recognised at the time. He'd called for help. With his final seconds, the man who started the whole team had reached out to someone we hadn't met yet, and then the screen goes dark. No joke this time, just dread and dust and a blinking pager on an empty street. Ant-Man and the Wasp 2018 came out very shortly after, and it has the strange job of being a light, breezy caper that happens to be set right around that same catastrophe, so its scenes carry an unexpected gut punch. In the first, Scott Lang, our friendly shrinking hero, has been sent down into the microscopic quantum realm to gather some energy, while his three companions monitor him from the surface and chat over the radio. And then, mid-sentence, all three of them turn to dust, just like that. The radio goes quiet. Scott, tiny and alone down in the realm, is left calling up into a void, with nobody left at the controls to bring him back. He's stranded, and he doesn't even know why. The second scene is the absurd counterpoint, and it's almost cruel how funny it is. Throughout the film, Scott had been fooling the authorities monitoring his house arrest by leaving a giant ant behind to mimic his daily routine. And the final shot of the film is that ant, alone in the empty house, still dutifully drumming away on a tiny drum kit, completely oblivious, while outside the world falls apart from the disaster we just witnessed. The dread and the joke pushed to their absolute extreme, and somehow both landing. Captain Marvel 2019 arrived between the catastrophe and its resolution, partly to introduce the very hero that Pager had been calling. Its two scenes split the difference between weighty and daft. In the first, we're back in the present, in the aftermath of the disaster, and the surviving heroes are gathered around that same pager, fretting over it, trying to work out who on earth Fury was trying to reach and why the signal suddenly stopped. And as they puzzle over it, they turn around, and she's just there, standing in the room. Carol Danvers, the hero from the film we'd just watched, arrived at last, asking plainly where Fury is. The cavalry finally answering the call. The second scene is a complete tonal swerve back to the film's 1990s setting, where a seemingly ordinary house cat, who is rather more than a cat, calmly coughs up the Tesseract onto a desk, having apparently been keeping the most powerful object in the universe in its stomach for safekeeping. From the fate of half the universe to a cat being sick, that's the range. And then Avengers, Endgame, 2019, the film that resolved it all. And here's the bold choice I mentioned. After everything, after the most anticipated film, maybe in the history of the medium, the credits roll and there is no scene. No tease, no setup for what's next, nothing. Instead, faintly, under the final moments of the credits, you hear a sound. A rhythmic clang, metal being struck by a hammer, over and over. And that's all. If you knew your history, you recognised it. It was the sound of the very first film of a man in a cave, hammering out the first crude version of a suit of armour that started this entire saga. There's no character, no image, just that sound, bookending 11 years and 20-something films with the noise it all began with. I think it's a genuinely beautiful decision. After a decade of training us to wait for the tease of what's coming next, they ended the chapter by giving us instead a quiet echo of where it started, and then letting the room go silent. Sometimes, the absence of a scene says more than a scene ever could. Since we're past the big resolution now, the scenes change character a bit. The Infinity Stones are done, the saga that drove all those earlier teases is finished, and so the post-credit scenes in this next stretch are feeling around for what the universe is going to be about next. And the answer, gradually, turns out to be the multiverse, the idea that there are countless other versions of reality stacked alongside this one. The scenes here are doing the same job the very early ones did, introducing people and planting seeds, except now the seeds are scattered across a much wider, stranger field. Spider-Man, Far From Home 2019, technically lands right at the tail end of this period, and its first scene is one of the most consequential cliffhangers the series ever did. Peter is swinging through New York with his girlfriend, happy when they land in front of a big public screen and a news broadcast comes on. The footage has been doctored by the film's villain to frame Peter for the disasters, and then, as a final twist of the knife, the broadcast reveals his name and face to the entire world. Spider-Man, unmasked, in front of everyone. Peter's face just falls. In an instant, his whole life is upended, and the film cuts to black on his horror. It's a proper hook, and it set up the entire premise of his next film. The second scene pulls the rug out in a different way. It's revealed that Nick Fury and Maria Hill, who we'd been watching throughout the film, were never actually them. They were shape-shifting aliens, Talos and his wife, standing in for the real Fury, who it turns out has been off relaxing on an enormous spaceship full of other shapeshifters this whole time. A fun little reframe that quietly told you Fury had bigger things going on off-screen. Black Widow 2021 sits a bit out of order in the timeline, but its scene jumps forward to after the big resolution. Yelena, the sharp, funny younger sister figure from the film, is visiting a grave, and she's interrupted by a smirking, fur-coated woman who's becoming a recurring presence in these scenes, a shadowy operative who hands out morally murky assignments. This woman gives Yelena a new target and points her manipulatively at one of the heroes, claiming he's responsible for her sister's death. It's a grief being aimed like a weapon, and it sets up a personal grudge for later. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings 2021 gives us two. The first is a lovely "Welcome to the bigger world" scene, where our new hero and his best friend are brought into a meeting with a couple of established faces, a sorcerer and two other heroes appearing as flickering holograms, all of them trying to work out what his mysterious ancient rings really are and where they came from. They discover the rings are sending out some kind of signal, a beacon, to somewhere unknown, and nobody can say where or to whom. An open question, left hanging pleasantly. After the serious business, the meeting breaks up, and the youngsters, told to go home and rest, decide instead to go out for karaoke, which is exactly the right note. The second scene reveals that the hero's sister, who'd announced she was going to shut down their late father's criminal empire, has done no such thing. She's taken it over herself, and is now running it on her own terms, training women into its ranks. A quiet little subversion. Eternals 2021 also has two, and both are pure introduction. In the first post-credits scene of Eternals, Thena, Makari, and Druig are visited by Eros and Pip. He knows their friends are in trouble and offers to help. In the second, a man we'd seen dating one of the heroes opens a long-locked family case and reaches toward an ancient, ominous sword. And just as he does, an unseen voice from the shadows asks whether he's really ready for this. That voice belonged to a character a lot of fans had been desperate to see for years. Now, I'll be honest with you here because it's relevant. A fair few of these Phase 4 threads, including both of these, have just sort of sat there since unresolved, waiting on films that have shuffled around the schedule. It's the nature of planting this many seeds at once. Some of them sprout and some of them are still, years later, just buried in the ground, being patient. I don't say that as a complaint exactly. It's just the honest state of things. And there's something almost endearing about a universe with this many loose threads gently flapping in the breeze. Spider-Man, No Way Home 2021, the film that finally dealt with Peter's exposed identity, has a slightly unusual pair. The first isn't really about our heroes at all. It features a character on loan from a connected but separate set of films. A man bonded to an alien symbiote, sitting in a bar in Mexico, getting drunk and being filled in by a bartender on all the wild history of this universe he's somehow landed in. He resolves to go and find Spider-Man, and then, comically, he gets yanked back to his own reality before he can, leaving behind only a small blob of the alien goo. The second scene is really just a trailer for the next Doctor Strange film, bolted onto the end, which is a thing the series did occasionally, treating a coming attractions reel as the stinger. There was also, for a later re-release of the film, a different bonus scene swapped in. A sweet little thing checking in on Peter's old classmates and how the events of the film had quietly rearranged their lives. And Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness 2022 closes this stretch with two. The first introduces a striking new character who steps out of a portal to tell Strange that all his reality bending has caused damage, a rupture between worlds, an incursion, and that he needs to come with her right now to deal with it. She slices open a doorway, and the two of them stride into a churning purple dimension. A proper, your actions have consequences, off we go, handoff. The second is the joke, a callback to a minor gag from the film involving a street vendor who'd been magically cursed to keep punching himself, finally getting his reprieve as the spell wears off, to his enormous relief. Big cosmic doorway, small man punching himself. The balance holds even here. Let's keep drifting forward into the films that close out Phase 4 and open Phase 5. By now the post-credit scene is such an ingrained ritual that the variety on offer is enormous. We've got bickering Greek gods, a heaven for warriors, an entire stadium full of the same villain, and one truly tender little family scene that I think is among the best of the lot. Nice spread, this stretch. Thor, Love and Thunder 2022 gives us two, and the first reaches all the way back to Greek mythology. Zeus, the king of the gods, who'd had a rough encounter with Thor during the film, and is now nursing his wounded pride, decides that the way to restore the proper fear and respect owed to gods is to have Thor killed. And he summons his son to carry out the deed, a strapping fellow we see only briefly, sent off to hunt our hero, a grudge planted. The second scene is gentler and rather lovely. Jane, who'd been through a great deal in the film, finds herself arriving at the gates of the Asgardian afterlife, the warrior's paradise reserved for those who fall bravely in battle. And she's welcomed there at the threshold by a familiar guardian figure who thanks her warmly for having looked out for his son during her time among the living. A soft, peaceful landing for a character who'd earned it. Black Panther. Wakandu. Forever 2022 takes a different approach and offers just one scene, in the middle of the credits, and it's quiet. And it's about grief. And I want to slow right down for it because I think it's genuinely one of the most affecting things in this entire catalogue. The film as a whole was made under the shadow of a real loss, the passing of the actor who'd played the king, and so the story is steeped in mourning. And then, in this scene, the late king's sister is on a beach when she's gently led to a revelation. She's introduced to a young boy, and she learns that her brother, before he died, had a son, a child he and the boy's mother had chosen to raise quietly, far from the pressures and dangers of the throne, which is why nobody had known, why they hadn't even come to the funeral. And the boy steps forward and tells her his name. He has a local name that he goes by, but his other name, his true name, the one his father gave him, is the same as his father's. The king's name carried forward in a small boy on a beach. It's a way of saying that what was lost continues, that the line goes on, and it's done with such restraint that it lands like a held breath. No spectacle, just a quiet, aching bit of continuation. Ant-Man and the Wasp. Quantum Mania 2023 opened Phase 5 and leaned hard into setting up the villain, who was, at the time, meant to be the next big bad. Both its scenes are about him. In the first, the mid-credits one, we find ourselves in a vast arena where three regal, differently costumed figures sit in discussion. They are all unsettlingly variants of the same man, the time-travelling conqueror from the film, and they're concerned that the meddling of Earth's heroes is threatening everything they've built across time. They decide it's time to act, and the camera pulls back to reveal that the arena is packed, absolutely heaving, with thousands upon thousands more versions of the same man, all gathered, all listening, an army of one person wearing a million faces. The second scene is lighter and ties into the streaming series featuring the Trickster God, showing two characters from that show observing yet another variant of the Conqueror, an affable inventor type, giving a presentation at a World's Fair over a century ago, with one of them quietly terrified at the sight of him, and the other completely failing to understand why. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 2023 sent that crew off with two warm, valedictory scenes. The first shows us the new shape of the team, reformed and changed, with old members moved on and new faces stepping up. The once tiny tree now fully grown, a new leader at the helm, defending a township from a stampede. Life going on. The second is a sweet small domestic beat, the team's former captain back on Earth, having breakfast with his elderly grandfather, easing into an ordinary life, grumbling amiably about being asked to mow a neighbour's lawn, and a little caption promises that this particular hero will return one day. A gentle, see you later rather than a goodbye. And the Marvels 2023 closes this run with a single, quietly seismic scene. One of the heroes knocked through a tear in reality during the film wakes up in an unfamiliar medical bay, and beside her is a version of her own mother, alive, but not quite the mother she knew, going by a different name. And also in the room examining her is a blue, furry, bespectacled figure, a brilliant and gentle scientist who calmly explains that she's been transported to another universe entirely. And for those who knew their wider Marvel history, that scientist was a very big deal because he belonged to a team of mutant heroes who had, for decades, lived in an entirely separate set of films. His appearance here was the universe quietly, deliberately, cracking open a door that fans had been hoping to see opened for a very long time. The hero, taking all this in, sums it up with a single, perfect muttered swear word, which, honestly, fair enough. Which brings us, more or less, up to where the story currently sits, the most recent stretch of films. And the scenes here are all, in one way or another, pointing toward a big collision that's being built up to. The teasers have gone back to doing what they did at the very start, laying track for an enormous team-up down the line. There's a pleasing symmetry to that. The whole thing began with a man in a coat saying, "I'm putting together a team," and here we are again, all these years later, with the scenes quietly arranging the pieces for another gathering. Deadpool and Wolverine 2024 is a slightly special case because its big after-credits moment isn't really a scene in the usual sense at all. It's a tribute. As the credits play, the film runs a montage of behind-the-scenes footage and clips spanning 2 decades of an earlier era of Marvel films, the ones made by a different studio before this universe absorbed them, set to a wistful, nostalgic song about saying goodbye to the time you've had. And it's really moving because that era is where the 2 lead characters of this very film came from in the first place. Without those older, scrappier, sometimes brilliant and sometimes deeply flawed films, neither of these actors would have become the icons they are. So it plays as a heartfelt thank you, a farewell to 20 years of a thing, woven right into the credits. There's also a small second gag, a quick bit where one of the heroes pulls up some footage to prove a point about an outlandish claim made earlier in the film, confirming that yes, against all odds, his ridiculous story actually checked out. But it's the tribute montage that sticks with you. A rare post-credit scene that's purely about looking backward with affection rather than forward with intrigue. Captain America Brave New World 2025 brings us back to the multiverse track. The new Captain America visits a captured, calculating villain figure in a high-security prison, the same prison where a recently disgraced political leader is now being held. And this villain, smug and certain, issues a warning. He tells our hero that something is coming, that he should prepare for the arrival of others from other places. It's deliberately ominous and deliberately vague, the kind of line designed to make you sit up and think about worlds bumping into one another. The groundwork for a much bigger conflict laid in a quiet prison conversation. Thunderbolts 2025, which by its end has rebranded its ragtag group of anti-heroes into a new sort of team, lands one of the most genuinely exciting teases in years. Sometime after the events of the film, 14 months later, the team is alerted to something appearing out in space, a ship, approaching from beyond their own reality, flagged as interdimensional. And as their alarms go off, we see the vessel, and on its hull is a large, unmistakable number 4, the arrival of a famous family of heroes, crossing over into the main universe from somewhere else. After years of teases that sometimes went nowhere, this one felt tangible, immediate, a promise about the very next film and the bigger crossover beyond it. People in cinemas reportedly made quite a lot of noise at that number 4. And the most recent film in our walk, The Fantastic Four. First Steps 2025, the one introducing that very family, has 2 scenes. And here's a detail I want to be straight with you about, because it's the sort of thing that's easy to get muddled. This film is set in its own separate universe, a retro-flavoured world, all of its own, not the main one. And, interestingly, despite that big ship tease in the previous film, this one doesn't follow up on it directly. The director has been quite open that the timing of the 2 films meant they were made somewhat independently, like runners passing a baton, so they don't line up as neatly as you might assume. It's a good reminder that even a machine this well-oiled is still made by people working on overlapping schedules. Anyway, the first scene, the mid-credits one, is lovely and creepy. The mother of the family discovers her young son in the company of a mysterious cloaked stranger, a figure holding a metal mask, heavily implied to be a very famous and very dangerous villain whose name looms over everything coming next. The second scene is a complete change of pace, a charming light little clip from a cartoon show that exists within the world of the film, featuring animated versions of the heroes. A spooky tease and a sweet cartoon side by side. That balance, the dread and the gentle joke, right to the very end of the run. Some things never change, and I'm glad they don't. Since we've now walked the whole length of it, start to finish, I want to sit for a while with the actual craft of these things, because the more you look at them as a group, the more you notice they're a truly peculiar little art form. Most of them run somewhere between half a minute and a couple of minutes. That's nothing. That's less time than it takes to make a cup of tea properly, and yet some of them carry more weight than entire films do, and they have to do it with almost no room to work in. Think about what a good one actually has to pull off in that sliver of time. It can't slow down the film it's attached to, because it comes after the film is over. It can't rely on you remembering much, because you've just sat through 2.5 hours, and your brain is full. It often has to introduce someone you've never seen, or pay off something you might have forgotten, or set a hook for a film that won't come out for another year or 2. And it has to do all of that while you're physically halfway out of your seat, coat half on, working out where you parked. That's a brutal little set of constraints, and I think that's exactly why the best ones are so satisfying, because they're solving a near impossible problem with enormous economy. A man turns around in a chair and smiles, and that's an entire villain established. 2 scientists hand over a red rock and say a single line, and suddenly you understand the architecture of the next 5 years. It's compression of an extreme kind. One thing that fascinates me is how the rhythm of them changes depending on what mood the film needs to leave you in. After the lighter films, you nearly always get a joke, because the studio wants you walking out grinning. After the heavier ones, you get dread, or a tease, something to chew on. And after the really enormous emotional gut punches, sometimes you get nothing at all, or something so quiet it barely registers, because the worst possible thing would be to undercut the feeling you've just had with a wink. The placement of these scenes, the choice of when to make you laugh and when to leave you in silence, is doing a lot more emotional management than people give it credit for. It's the studio deciding very deliberately how they want you to feel as you walk back out into the car park, and once you start watching for that, you can't unsee it. There's also the question of the two-scene structure, the mid-credits scene, and then the post-credits scene, which became the standard format for so many of these films. The mid-credits one, the one that plays after just the main cast names, tends to be the meatier, more story-relevant one, because more people are still sitting there to catch it. And the post-credits one, the one right at the very end, after every last gaffer and caterer has scrolled by, tends to be the daft little throwaway, the reward for the truly devoted who sat through absolutely everything. There's a kind of unspoken contract in that. Stay a bit, get the plot tease. Stay to the bitter end, get the silly treat. It's a clever way of rewarding different levels of commitment, and I find the politeness of it quite sweet, honestly. The film's saying, in effect, here's a little something for everyone, depending on how much patience you've got tonight. Now, since we're on the topic of how these scenes work, let's talk a bit about the recurring figures who kept turning up in them, because one of the quiet pleasures of watching the whole run in order is spotting the same faces appearing again and again in the margins, stitching everything together. The obvious one, the one we kept bumping into, is the man in the long coat, the S.H.I.E.L.D. director with the eye patch. For years, he was practically the official greeter of the entire universe, the character whose job, more than anyone else's, was to appear at the end of a film and gesture toward the bigger picture. He's there in the very first one, in the shadows of the mansion. He's there showing the scientist the glowing cube. He's there approaching the man out of time about a mission. He's there devastatingly turning to dust on a city street while triggering a pager. If you tracked just his appearances in these scenes, you'd have a decent skeleton of the whole saga. There's something quite fitting about that, actually, because within the story, he's the man whose entire job is to see the connections nobody else can see, to know that all these separate people are part of one larger thing. So of course he's the one who keeps showing up to whisper that to us, the audience, from the edges of the frame. Then there's the gentleman who appeared in nearly every single one of these films in some tiny role, the legendary comics creator whose characters all of this was built on. He'd pop up as a bus driver, a security guard, a delivery man, a face in a crowd, and the films turned spotting him into a beloved little game. And as we saw, one of those 5 Guardian scenes was built entirely around him, casting him as a small-time storyteller, boring a group of cosmic beings, which was a lovely, knowing tribute. After he passed away, those cameos took on a much more bittersweet quality, little time capsules of a man delighting in the worlds he'd helped dream up. Watching for him became its own quiet ritual, layered on top of the post-credit ritual. 2 games of patience, running at once. And then there are the smaller recurring presences. The smirking operative in the fur coat who started turning up to recruit people for murky purposes. The trickster god who kept faking his own death and reappearing in the corners of other people's films. The various scientists and handlers and middlemen who'd resurface a film or 2 later, often in these very scenes, reminding you that this was all one connected place where people remembered each other and old debts came due. That sense of a populated, continuous world where a minor character from years ago might wander back into frame is a huge part of what made the whole project feel alive rather than like a series of disconnected adventures. And the post-credits scenes were one of the main places that continuity got to show off, because they had the freedom to reach across films and link hands in a way the main stories sometimes couldn't. Here's a thing worth talking about gently, because it's true, and I'd rather be honest than pretend otherwise. Not every one of these scenes paid off. Some of them planted a seed that grew into a whole film. Others planted a seed that just sat there for years. Some of them are still sitting there. We touched on a few of these as we went. The disillusioned sorcerer draining a man's magic and muttering about there being too many of his kind. A thread that looked like it was setting up a major conflict, and then quietly evaporated when the relevant film went another way. the golden being created in a birthing pod for revenge, who took years to really turn up, and then did so in a rather different shape than that scene implied. The roguish space brother offering to help, the ancient sword, and the voice in the shadows, both still more or less waiting in the wings, as I talk to you now. And I find I don't mind this nearly as much as some people do, partly because it's the honest cost of trying to build something this enormous and this interconnected. If you're going to plant hundreds of little seeds across dozens of films over all those years, some of them are simply going to land on rocky ground. Schedules shift, plans change, actors become unavailable, the whole direction of the universe pivots, and a thread that made perfect sense to set up in 1 year looks like a dead end 3 years later. That's not a failure of craft so much as the natural weather of a project this size. And partly, I don't mind because there's something genuinely charming about a fictional universe with loose ends flapping about in it. Real life is full of plans that never came together, intentions that fizzled, doors that got opened, and then, for whatever reason, never walked through. A story world that has a few of those too feels oddly more lived in, more real than one where every single setup gets a tidy payoff. It gives the whole thing texture. It means that when you watch these scenes in order, you're not just watching a perfectly executed master plan unfold. You're watching people try things, some of which worked beautifully and some of which didn't. And that's a much more human and a much more interesting thing to watch than flawless machinery. So when we hit one of those dangling threads, I tend to just smile at it and move on, the way you might smile at an old note to yourself that you never did get round to acting on. Let's wander into the behind-the-scenes side for a while, because some of these scenes have lovely little stories attached to how they actually got made. And that kind of thing is exactly what I like to natter on about when the lights are low. We mentioned the shawarma scene earlier, the wordless team meal at the end of the first big team up. The detail that always delights me about it is the timing of when it was shot. It wasn't part of the main production. They went back and filmed it very late, after the film had essentially been finished and even shown to people, which is why it has that slightly different look to it. If you watch closely, one of the cast is barely visible, tucked at the edge of frame, because by the time they got round to filming it, he was deep into growing a beard and changing his appearance for a completely different role and couldn't really be the centre of attention, so they just sort of hid him in the composition and made it work. And the wonderful thing is that none of that backstage scramble shows in the final product. It just looks like 6 exhausted heroes, too tired to talk. The mess and the improvisation are completely invisible, which is sort of the whole magic trick of filmmaking in a nutshell. The very first one, The Man in the Mansion, has its own charming production wrinkle. By many accounts, the studio behind it was, at the time, a much smaller and more financially precarious operation than it later became, and the idea of teasing a giant interconnected universe was wildly ambitious for a company in that position. They were essentially writing a check against a future they weren't at all sure they'd get to cash. That little scene was a statement of enormous confidence from people who had every reason to be nervous, and the actor they brought in to deliver it lent the whole gambit an instant gravity it might not otherwise have had. It's worth remembering that, at the time, nobody watching had any reason to believe this would become the sprawling thing it became. It could very easily have been a one-off tease that led nowhere, a promise quietly forgotten. The fact that it didn't is a big part of why we're here at all. Then there's the whole business of how secretive these scenes became. As the films got bigger, the post-credits scenes turned into some of the most fiercely guarded secrets in the whole production. Cast members would talk in interviews about not being told what was in them, about scenes being shot on closed sets with skeleton crews, about pages of script being kept deliberately vague or even fake to throw off leaks. The scene became this prize that had to be protected at all costs, because so much of its value was in the surprise. The whole point of a man turning around and smiling, or a hero appearing in a doorway, is that you didn't see it coming. So an entire apparatus of secrecy grew up around protecting these tiny moments, which is a slightly absurd amount of effort to expend on a scrap of footage barely a minute long, and also completely understandable, because that scrap was sometimes the most talked about part of the entire release. And here's a small one I enjoy. The convention got so well established that the absence of a scene became its own kind of statement, as we saw with the big finale that ended on just a sound. By that point, the audience was so thoroughly trained to wait that not giving them anything was a genuine creative choice with weight to it. You can only subvert an expectation once everyone shares it, and these films had spent many years building exactly that shared expectation. So the empty credits, the hammer on metal, and nothing else only works as a gesture because of all the scenes that came before it. The whole history of the ritual is what gives the silence its meaning. I think that's rather beautiful, the way a thing can become so established that its own absence starts to speak. Now, since we're going through these in the order they came out, let me talk a little about the different ways you could approach watching the scenes themselves, if you ever found yourself with an evening and a strange determination to do so. Because there's more than one sensible way to do it, and they give you quite different experiences. The way we've done it tonight, release order, is in my view the best way to really feel the universe being built, because you experience the teases in the order they were meant to be discovered, which means you feel the patience of it. You feel what it was like to see that grin in the dark, and then have to wait years for it to mean anything. You feel the handoffs working in real time, one film reaching forward to grab the next. Release order preserves the suspense, the slow accumulation, the sense of a plan unfolding just slightly faster than you can keep up with. It's the order that respects how it was actually lived through by the people who watched these films as they came out, sitting in cinemas, theorising with their mates afterward about what it all meant. There's another way though, which is to watch everything in the order the events happen within the story, the in-universe chronological order, which is wildly different from the release order in places. And that's a fascinating experiment. But it does odd things to the post-credit scenes, because a scene designed as a forward-looking tease suddenly sits in a completely different context. A moment that was meant to make you gasp at what's coming instead becomes a quiet confirmation of something you already know is on its way. The dread drains out of it. The surprise evaporates. So while chronological order is a lovely way to watch the films as a continuous story, it more or less dismantles the entire art form of the post-credit scene, because that art form depends so heavily on not yet knowing. The tease only works as a tease if the thing it's teasing is still in your future. Rearrange the timeline and you've quietly diffused all of them. And then there's the purest version of what we're doing, which is to ignore the films almost entirely and just watch the scenes themselves, one after another, stripped of everything around them. Which sounds like it shouldn't work, like it'd be a meaningless jumble without the films to give them context. But it sort of does work, in a strange way, because as a sequence they tell their own compressed little story. You get the whole shape of the saga in fragments, the introductions and the teases and the jokes and the gut punches, all in a row, like flipping through a photo album of a long holiday. You lose the depth, obviously. You lose the 2.5 hours of character work that makes any given tease land, but you gain this odd dreamlike overview, the universe reduced to its punctuation marks, which, now that I say it, is more or less exactly what we've been doing tonight, isn't it? Just talking instead of watching. Same album narrated. One thing that creeps up on you, watching these scenes in sequence, is how often the real star of a post-credit scene isn't a person at all. It's an object, a thing, a prop that the films invested with so much meaning that its mere appearance became an event in itself. And I find that really interesting, the way a story can train you to feel a jolt at the sight of a particular object, the way you would at the appearance of a beloved character. Think of the glowing blue cube. The first time we really saw it, properly, it was sitting in a case being shown to a scientist, and it meant almost nothing to most of the audience. just a pretty prop. But over the films that followed, that cube accumulated so much significance, caused so much trouble, passed through so many hands, that by the time it turned up again, coughed up by a cat of all things, its appearance was a genuine laugh-out-loud payoff. The object had become a character. It had a history, a reputation, a kind of personality even. This troublesome glowing thing that everyone kept fighting over. And the scene played on your relationship with the object, not with any person in the frame. The same is true of the Golden Gauntlet. When the big villain pulled it from his vault and slipped it on, the power of that moment came almost entirely from what you'd learned to associate with the glove and the stones it was built to hold. It's just a piece of jewellery, really, an ornate metal glove. But the films had spent years teaching you to dread it, to understand it as the one thing that could end everything. So the simple image of him putting it on did more work than pages of dialogue could have. The object carried the threat, all by itself. And then the pager, the humble little pager, an outdated bit of 90s technology, which in the middle of the most devastating scene in the whole run became the single most important object on screen. A man's dying act was to make this obsolete little device do its one job. And the reason that lands so hard is that the films had quietly established, in an earlier scene, that this exact device existed and was meant for emergencies of the highest order. So when it appears again in his trembling hand as the world crumbles, you understand instantly what it means, even before the symbol lights up on its little screen. The object did the storytelling. A pager, of all things, made grown adults gasp in cinemas. That's a remarkable thing for a prop to achieve, and it only works because of the patient, careful way these scenes seeded the meaning of objects across years of films, so that a thing could carry the weight a person usually would. There's a lovely lesson in that, I think, about how stories actually work. We tend to assume meaning lies in characters, in the people we follow, but a really well-built world can pour meaning into anything. A cube, a glove, a hammer in a crater, a red rock handed over in a cluttered room. Give an object enough history and enough consequence, and it stops being scenery and starts being something you have feelings about. And the post-credit scenes, with their tiny run times and their need for instant impact, leaned on this trick constantly, because an object you already understand is the fastest possible way to make a short scene hit hard. We've covered all of them now, the whole catalogue, but I want to circle back and spend a bit more time with a handful of my favourites, the ones I think reward a second visit, because some of these scenes are doing something subtler than they first appear, and they're worth lingering over the way you'd linger over a good photograph, rather than just glancing at it. Take the silent meal again, the team slumped around a table eating after the battle. What I love about it, the more I think about it, is that it's a scene built entirely on what isn't happening. There's no dialogue, no plot, no setup for anything. It's pure aftermath, pure exhaustion, and it understands something true about big efforts, which is that the moment right after you've done the enormous thing isn't triumphant at all. It's flat, it's quiet. You're too tired to celebrate. You just want to sit down and eat something and not be asked any questions. We've all had that feeling on a much smaller scale after a hard day or a big push at work or a long journey. That bone-deep flatness where even good news can't quite reach you yet. And here are these godlike beings, fresh from saving the entire world, experiencing exactly that ordinary human come-down. It's funny because it's recognisable. It humanises them more than any heroic speech could. No notes, as I said before? It's perfect. Then there's that beach scene, the one about the king's son. I keep coming back to it because of how much restraint it shows. It would have been so easy to make that moment big, to swell the music and milk the emotion. Instead, it's hushed, almost shy. A woman and a boy and a quiet revelation, handled like a private family matter rather than a plot development. And the reason it works is that it trusts you to bring the feeling yourself. It doesn't tell you how to feel about loss and continuation and the way life insists on going on. It just shows you a child carrying his father's name and lets you do the rest. That trust, that willingness to underplay something enormous is rarer than you'd think. And it's a big part of why that particular scene lands so softly and stays with you so long. And the empty credits at the end of the big finale, which I'll defend as a post-credit scene, even though it technically isn't one, because the choice not to include a scene is itself a kind of scene. The longer I think about it, the more I admire the nerve of it. To have spent over a decade building the most reliable payoff in modern cinema, training millions of people to stay in their seats, and then, at the single biggest moment, to give them nothing but a sound, a hammer on metal, the noise the whole thing started with. It's confident in a way that's almost cheeky. It assumes you'll understand, assumes you've been paying attention, assumes the silence will mean something to you. And for the people who'd been there from the beginning, it did. It meant the chapter was genuinely closed, that this wasn't a tease for more, but a full stop. A door clicking quietly shut at the end of a very long corridor. What links these three, I think, is that they all understand that less can be more, that a scene doesn't have to shout to land. The loud, flashy teases get a lot of attention. The ships and the gauntlets and the villains turning to face the camera, and those are great fun. But the quiet ones, the meal and the beach and the silence, those are the ones I find myself thinking about when I'm lying awake. They're the scenes that aren't trying to make you gasp. They're just trying to make you feel something, gently, and then let you sit with it. Now let's go the other direction, because we've talked a lot about the weighty scenes, and it would be unfair to the daft ones to leave them as mere footnotes. The jokes did real work, and I want to give them their due. The drumming ant, for instance. On the surface, it's pure silliness, an oversized insect tapping away on a toy drum kit in an empty house. But think about where it's placed. The drumming ant scene comes after the credits roll, following the scene where the hero is stranded and his friends have crumbled to dust. So you've just had your heart broken, and then the film cuts to this absurd image of a giant ant cheerfully drumming on, completely unaware that the world has ended. And the effect of that juxtaposition is strange and truly clever. It doesn't undercut the sadness so much as sit alongside it. This image of obliviousness continuing in the middle of catastrophe. There's even something faintly poignant in it. The idea of small ordinary routines carrying on while everything falls apart elsewhere. A joke that's also, if you squint, a little bit melancholy. That's a hard trick to pull off in a single wordless shot of an insect. Or the endlessly refilling tankard. The gentle comedy of a god of thunder being plied with bottomless beer, while two characters sought out a polite arrangement to get him off the planet. It's a small, warm, character-driven bit of fun, and its job is mostly tonal, to send you out smiling and to establish an easy rapport between two characters who'd go on to share more screen time. The jokes were rarely just jokes. They were almost always doing something underneath, setting a mood, building a relationship, rewarding your attention with a laugh while quietly slipping in a bit of setup. The street vendor cursed to punch himself, finally freed when the spell wears off. The teenage tree refusing to tidy his room. The space pirate impaling his friend with a wayward arrow. The cosmic observers abandoning the old storyteller because they were bored, and also, it turns out, his lift. These are throwaways, sure, but they're throwaways with craft in them. They land because the timing is right, because they come at the exact moment you need a bit of lightness, because they understand that an audience that's just sat through a long, intense film is primed and grateful for something silly. And there's a generosity in that, a sense of the films wanting you to leave happy. The jokes are the universe being a good host, walking you to the door with a smile rather than leaving you on an ominous note. And if I'm being straight, for our purposes tonight, the jokes are a gift, because they're the easiest scenes to drift off to. There's no tension in them, nothing to keep your mind racing. A giant ant drumming in an empty room is about as gentle and low stakes an image as you could hope to fall asleep to. So if you've made it this far and your eyes are getting heavy, picture that ant, tapping away, perfectly content, completely oblivious. It's a nice thing to carry off into sleep. Let me trace something for you slowly, because I think it's one of the most satisfying patterns in the whole run, and following it from one end to the other is a lovely meandering way to appreciate how deliberately this was all assembled. I'm talking about the way these scenes pass things from one film to the next, hand to hand, like a relay we mentioned earlier. It starts with a name, just a name, dropped in a darkened mansion, an initiative, a team that doesn't exist yet, and from that single seed, you can follow a chain. The next teases introduce the players one at a time. A hammer in the desert points to a god. A glowing cube in a case points to power and trouble. A man out of time gets approached about a mission. And then they all converge, and the team that was just a name in the first scene becomes real and sits down to eat shawarma in silence. The setup paid off. The relay completed its first lap. And then it starts again, immediately, because that same team-up scene introduced a grinning villain, and now a new chain begins. This one about objects of cosmic power. A red rock handed to a collector with the line about 1 down, 5 to go. In a mid-credits scene, Thanos pulls the golden Infinity Gauntlet from a vault, a giant ship pulling alongside a refugee vessel. Each one a baton passed forward, each one narrowing the focus, until that chain too pays off in catastrophe and a pager on an empty street. 2 great relays, one after the other, each made of these tiny scenes reaching forward to grab the next film by the hand. What I find remarkable is how rarely the baton got dropped during the important stretches. For years, scene after scene connected, paid off, led somewhere. The man who appeared in the mansion turned up again and again, threading through until his dust and pager moment. Objects introduced casually came roaring back with enormous weight. Characters glimpsed for 2 seconds in a hydro cell became central players. It's a genuinely impressive piece of long-form construction, especially when you remember it was being built by many different writers and directors across many years, all somehow keeping the chain intact. Like a very long line of people passing buckets of water, none of them able to see both ends of the line, somehow still getting the water where it needed to go. And then, as we discussed, in the later stretch, the relay gets looser. Batons get passed to runners who aren't quite in position yet. Some chains start and then pause, waiting for films still to come. The director of one recent film being quite candid that he simply didn't know what the previous film's tease was going to be because of how the schedules overlapped, is a perfect little window into the reality of it. The relay is still running, but the runners are spread out further now, and sometimes one of them is still lacing up his shoes while the baton's already in the air. Which is fine. Which is, as I said, just the honest texture of a thing this big. But tracing the early chains, the tight ones, the ones where every handoff connected cleanly, that's one of the real pleasures of going through all of this in order. You get to watch a plan work. I want to talk for a bit about the people in the seats, because the post-credit scene isn't just a thing the films did, it's a thing that changed how audiences behaved. And the culture that grew up around it is really fascinating to me, in a low-key way that's perfect for a night like this. There was a time, not that long ago really, when the credits rolling meant the experience was over. Full stop. You got up, you filed out, you maybe complained about the parking. The credits were dead time, the bit they put at the end for legal and contractual reasons that nobody in the audience had any reason to watch. And then, over the course of these films, that completely flipped. Staying through the credits became a marker of being in the know. You'd see it happen in cinemas, this little social negotiation where some people would stand up to leave and others would hiss at them to sit back down. There's a scene, wait, trust me, sit down. The knowledgeable ones gently policing the room, making sure nobody missed it. And it created this lovely shared moment, because everyone who stayed was now sitting together in a strange in-between state, watching names scroll by that meant nothing to them, all of them waiting for the same thing. A low hum of anticipation building in a room full of strangers. And then the scene would come, and there'd be a collective reaction, a gasp or a laugh or a cheer that you only got because everyone had waited for it together. It turned the end of a film into a small communal event. People who'd never speak to each other otherwise, all united in the decision to sit through 10 minutes of small print on the promise of a brief payoff. It also created a whole little economy of information around whether a given film even had a scene, and how many, and whether they were worth waiting for. Whole websites sprang up dedicated to the single question of whether you should stay. Friends would text each other on the way to the cinema. There was genuine social value in being the person who knew there were 5 scenes this time, or in being the one who could lean over and whisper that the good one comes after the cast names, but the silly one's right at the very end. The films had accidentally created a new form of shared knowledge, a new little thing for fans to know and trade and feel clever about. And I think there's something quite warm about all of it, honestly. In an age where more and more of how we watch things became solitary, watched alone on a screen in our hands, often at 1:30 in the morning with one earbud in, the post-credits scene was this stubborn little engine of communal experience. It kept people in the room together for a few extra minutes. It rewarded patience collectively. It made the shared in-person experience of cinema mean something specific that you couldn't quite get the same way at home. There's a reason the biggest reactions to these scenes happened in packed opening night crowds rather than on a sofa. The waiting was better with other people. The payoff was bigger when it was shared. Here's a thought I keep turning over, and it's the kind of slightly grand idea that's nice to chew on quietly when you're winding down. If you wanted to understand what this whole enormous film project was really about, what its real underlying obsession was, you could do a lot worse than just studying its post-credit scenes, because they reveal the priorities. They show you what the people making it actually cared about most, and what they cared about more than anything was connection, the continuity, the sense that everything is part of one larger thing. Almost every single one of these scenes exists to make that point in some form. To say, this isn't a standalone story, it's a piece of something bigger, and here's a glimpse of how it connects. The relentless, almost compulsive linking of film to film, character to character, object to object, is the deepest value the whole project holds, and the post-credit scenes are where that value is most nakedly on display. They are, in a sense, the universe's mission statement, delivered in tiny installments. Everything connects, nothing is wasted, it all comes back. You also see in the scenes a real affection for the audience, a desire to reward attention, to give people who care a little extra, to make patience pay off. The whole structure of meatier scene first, sillier scene last is a kind of generosity, a way of having something for everyone. And the willingness to be daft, to end an enormous, serious film on a duck or a drumming ant or a man punching himself, shows a project that, for all its scale, never entirely lost its sense of humour about itself. That's a healthy thing, I think, in something this big. The capacity to be silly, the refusal to take itself completely seriously, even at its most epic. And you see ambition, obviously. Enormous, almost reckless ambition. The sheer nerve of planting seeds years in advance, of trusting that the project would survive long enough to pay them off, of building chains of setups that depended on films that didn't exist yet getting made and being hits. Every forward-looking tease was a bet on the future, a wager that there would be a future to pay it off in. And for a remarkably long stretch, those bets kept paying. The audacity of that, the confidence required to keep making promises about films years away, is written into every one of these scenes. They're not just teases, they're declarations of faith in the whole enterprise continuing. So the scenes are a kind of X-ray of the project's soul, if that's not too grand a way to put it on a quiet night. Connection, generosity, humour and nerve line up all the post-credit scenes, and that's what you find running through them. It's not a bad set of values for a thing to be built on, really. Whatever you make of any individual film, that underlying spirit, the wanting to connect everything and reward attention and have a bit of fun while doing something enormously ambitious is rather lovely. And it lives most purely in these little scraps at the end, the bits most people used to walk out on. Let me do one slow lap back through the whole thing, lightly, not re-explaining, just touching each part as we pass, the way you might walk back through a gallery you've already seen, nodding at the pictures you liked. It's a nice way to let it all settle. We began in the dark, in a mansion, with a name and a handshake, and an initiative that didn't exist yet. From there, the early teases laid out the players. A hammer, a cube, a man out of his time, each one a quiet promise pointing at the gathering to come. And the gathering came, and the team sat down to eat in silence while, elsewhere, a figure turned in his chair and smiled at the thought of them. Then the middle stretch, the patient one, where objects took centre stage. A red rock and a line about 5 more to go. A duck in the wreckage. A glove pulled from a vault by a figure tired of waiting. A suit revealed to a daughter. A friend restrained, and a quiet offer to call a guy. The pieces accumulating, the chains lengthening, the universe filling in around the edges. Then the busy, crowded stretch, doors flung open in every direction. A hidden nation revealed with a smirk. A man discovering the secret features of his new suit. A sorcerer turning cold. 5 scenes in a row, mostly jokes, taking the mick. A giant ship falling across a smaller one, like a shadow. Then the heavy part. A king at a podium, a friend healing in the sun, and then the dust and the pager and the symbol on the little screen. A hero arriving at last in a doorway. A cat being sick. And then, at the very end of it all, no scene at all, just the sound of a hammer on metal, and silence, and a door clicking shut. And then the long, searching stretch after, feeling around for what comes next. An unmasking, shapeshifters on a spaceship, rings sending a beacon to somewhere unknown, a roguish brother, and an ancient sword and threads left flapping. A new character slicing open a doorway to a purple dimension. Bickering gods and a warrior's heaven. A boy on a beach carrying his father's name. A stadium full of one man. A team reformed and a grandfather's breakfast. A muttered swear word in a medical bay in another universe. And finally, the most recent stretch, pointing forward again, back to where it started in spirit, arranging the pieces for another gathering, a tribute to 20 years of older films, a warning in a prison, a ship with a number 4 on its hull approaching from beyond, and a cloaked figure with a metal mask standing beside a child while everything readies itself for whatever comes next. That's the whole shape of it, walked through gently, end to end. Dozens of tiny scenes, most of them shorter than the time we've just spent talking about any one of them, somehow adding up to a single long story told in the margins. I find it genuinely lovely, laid out like that. All those little fragments, all that patience, all that reaching forward from one film to the next, a whole secret narrative hiding at the end of the credits, waiting for the people who stayed. I've talked a lot about what happens in these scenes, but not much about how they sound. And sound is doing an enormous amount of the work. So let's drift into that for a while, because it's a lovely, soft topic. For a quiet hour, music in these scenes tends to work in one of 2 ways. Either it leans into the mood the film has just left you in, carrying that feeling out into the scene, or it deliberately swerves against it for effect. The grin in the dark, for instance, comes with this low, ominous, swelling sort of dread underneath it. Music that tells you to be afraid of a character before you have any idea who he is or what he wants. You're frightened of him on pure sound, almost before your eyes have made sense of the image. That's the score doing the heavy lifting, priming you to take a wordless turn and smile as a genuine threat. Then you have the opposite approach, the comedic scenes that play sprightly, light, almost jaunty music under their silliness, the audio equivalent of a wink. The tonal swerve from a heavy film into a bouncy little joke is often signalled by the music before anything else. A sudden shift in register, that tells your body it's allowed to relax now. The scary part's over. Here's something daft. Your shoulders drop a half inch the moment the music changes, before you've even registered why. And then there's the most striking use of sound in the whole run, which we keep coming back to because it's so bold. The big finale that ended on nothing but a rhythmic, metallic clang. No music at all. Just that bare, repetitive industrial sound, stripped of any score, echoing in the dark. And the absence of music there is the entire point. By giving you nothing to feel, no swelling strings to tell you how to react, the silence forces you to supply the feeling yourself, to recognize the sound and understand what it means without any guidance. It's the audio equivalent of being trusted to find your own way out of a room in the dark. And because you've spent so many films being guided by these scores, the sudden removal of all that guidance is truly affecting. The silence rings. There's also the matter of certain musical themes becoming attached to certain characters and groups, so that the mere sound of a particular bit of music in a post-credit scene tells you who's about to matter, sometimes before you see them. The arrival of that ship with the number 4 on it, for instance, comes with a specific theme that fans of those characters recognize instantly, a musical announcement of who's coming. The music arrives a half second ahead of the meaning, and for the people in the know, that half second is electric. They hear who it is before they're told. That's a wonderful thing for a score to be able to do, to carry identity, to let a few notes function as a name. And the post-credit scenes, with their need to convey a great deal very fast, used that constantly. Letting music do the introducing so the brief runtime could be spent on the moment itself. So if you ever go back and watch these with the sound up, pay attention to what the music is doing, or pointedly not doing. It's quietly steering your emotions the whole time, deciding when you're scared and when you're allowed to laugh, and just once, memorably, leaving you alone in the silence to feel whatever you're going to feel. It's some of the most efficient emotional work in the whole catalogue, and it mostly happens without anyone consciously noticing, which is rather the mark of it being done well. There's a quality running through this entire subject that I want to name properly before we wind down, because it's the thing I find most quietly admirable about the whole post-credit tradition, and it's a fitting note for a slow night. And that quality is patience. An almost unreasonable amount of patience on the part of both the people making these scenes and the people watching them. Consider what it asks of an audience. A scene plants a grinning figure in the dark, and then asks you to hold that image, to carry it around in the back of your mind for years before it pays off. A scene says 5 to go and trusts you to keep counting across film after film, year after year, slowly watching the tally fill in. That's a remarkable thing to ask of people, that they hold a thread that loosely for that long, and an even more remarkable thing that so many people happily did it, kept the count, remembered the grin, theorised and waited and stayed engaged across an awfully long stretch. The films asked for patience and the audience supplied it in abundance, which is a kind of trust flowing in both directions that you don't often see between a piece of entertainment and the people consuming it. And on the making side, the patience is just as striking. To set up a payoff years before you can deliver it. To introduce a character in a 2-second glimpse and then not properly use them for several films. To build chains of setups that depend on a future you can't guarantee. That requires a kind of long-term faith, a willingness to plant things you won't get to harvest for ages, that runs completely counter to how most entertainment works, which is to grab attention now and worry about later. The post-credit scene is built on the opposite instinct. The slow instinct, the gardener's instinct. Plant it now. Tend it. Wait. Let it grow in its own time. Some of these seeds took the better part of a decade to flower, and the people who planted them were content to wait that long. I think that's genuinely countercultural, in a small way, and rather beautiful. We live in a moment that's not very patient, that wants everything resolved quickly, that struggles to hold a thread across even a single evening, let alone across years. And here's this whole tradition built on the opposite virtue, on the pleasure of the slow reveal, the long game, the payoff you have to earn through sheer endurance of memory, the reward for sitting through the credits again and again, faithfully, for years. There's something almost meditative in it when you look at it that way. Not in the breathing exercise sense, but in the sense of an attention sustained gently over a very long time, a thread held loosely but never quite let go of. And maybe that's part of why going through all of these in one quiet sitting feels so pleasant. It collapses all that patience into a single evening. All those years of waiting, all those slow reveals gathered up and laid out end to end. So you can feel the whole long arc of it in one go, at your own unhurried pace, with nowhere to be and nothing to rush toward. The patience that took 15 years to play out, experienced gently, all at once, on a night with the lights down low. One more pass through a particular type of scene, because I think it deserves its own moment, and it's a calm, expansive sort of topic to drift through. I'm talking about the scenes whose job was not to tease a single film, but to crack open an entirely new region of the universe. The ones that didn't just say, "Here comes another adventure," but here is a whole new kind of thing you didn't know existed. The cosmic side was opened this way. For a long time, these films were grounded more or less in a recognizable world of soldiers and scientists and businessmen in metal suits. And then a scene drops you into a ruined museum on a far-off world with a talking duck and a space dog. And suddenly you understand that the canvas is much, much bigger than you'd assumed. That there are aliens and empires and strange collectors out among the stars, and the films are going to go there. A single scene quietly expanded the borders of the whole map. After that, the universe could go anywhere, and you'd already been told to expect it. The magic side was opened similarly, with scenes that established sorcerers and other dimensions, and the idea that, alongside all the science and technology, there was an entire hidden layer of reality running on completely different rules. That was a big thing to introduce into a universe that had, until then, leaned mostly on the language of science, however far-fetched. The scenes had to gently tell you, this too is real now. Magic is a thing here, adjust your expectations accordingly. And they did it with a light enough touch that it never felt like a jarring rule change, more like a curtain being pulled back on a part of the house you hadn't been shown yet. And then most recently, the multiverse, the idea that there are countless parallel versions of everything, which the scenes have been steadily establishing as the next great expansion of the borders. A doorway sliced open into a churning dimension. A version of a mother who isn't quite the right mother. A furry blue scientist explaining you've been transported elsewhere. A ship arriving from beyond reality with a number on its hull. Each of these scenes is doing that same fundamental job. The job of standing at the edge of the known map and pointing outward, saying, there's more out there, more than you thought, and we're going. The map keeps getting bigger, and it's nearly always these little end of credits scenes that are sent out first to plant the flag in the new territory. There's something I find really lovely about that recurring function. The post-credits scene, as the universe's scout, the first thing sent over the horizon to report back that there's something out there worth exploring. Long before a new corner gets its own films, it usually gets its first whisper here, in a minute or less at the end of someone else's story. The cosmic, the magical, the multiversal, all of them announce themselves this way, first quietly, in the margins, to the people who stayed in their seats. It's a humble place to launch something enormous from, the tail end of the credits, and yet that's where so many of the biggest expansions of this whole world began. A scout sent ahead into the dark, coming back to say, you'll want to see this, come and look. There's more. Not every scene we've discussed got the reaction it deserved on the night, and I've got a soft spot for the ones that flew slightly under the radar, the scenes plenty of people genuinely missed because they'd already left or weren't paying close attention. So let me spend a moment with a few of the ones that were easy to walk out on, because there's a quiet pleasure in giving the overlooked ones their due. The scientist studying his own memorial in a museum, for instance, the brainwashed friend slowly trying to reassemble who he used to be. It's a tiny melancholy scene. No action, no tease of a big adventure. Just a man standing quietly in front of an exhibit about his own lost life. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to miss, and it's one of the more human moments in the whole run, a person trying to remember himself. I love that they put something that gentle and that sad in a spot most people treated as a fun bonus, or the operative in the fur coat turning up at a graveside to weaponize someone's grief. On first watch, it reads as a fairly standard, here's a new mission setup, and a lot of people clocked it as exactly that and no more. But there's a real nastiness underneath it, a deliberate cruelty in aiming a grieving person at a target by lying to them about who's to blame for their loss. It's a small, cold piece of character work hiding inside what looks like a routine tease, and it rewards a closer look. Or the meeting where the new hero learns his ancient rings are sending a beacon to somewhere unknown. The headline of that scene is the open question, the mystery of where the signal's going. But the lovely bit, the bit that's easy to skate past, is the warmth of it. The way the established characters welcome the newcomers into the bigger world, and then the youngsters, told to go and rest, decide instead to go and sing karaoke. There's a real affection in that, a sense of these people actually liking each other. That's easy to miss if you're only watching for the plot hook. I suppose what I'm saying is that the post-credit scenes weren't only the big loud teases everyone remembers. Tucked among them were these quieter, stranger, more human little moments that didn't shout for attention, and that plenty of people understandably missed on the way to the exit. And going back through all of them slowly, the way we have tonight, is a chance to catch the ones you walked out on. To stand in front of the small sad exhibit you hurried past the first time, and really look at it. I want to end the wandering, before we properly wind down, on the simplest and maybe the most relevant thought of all, given what this video is for. And it's about the particular comfort of these scenes, the specific reason I think they make such good company on a night like this. The thing about a post-credit scene is that it's, by its nature, a small promise. It exists to tell you that the story isn't over, that there's more, that things continue. Even the saddest of them, even the dust and the pager, are followed eventually by another film, another scene, another continuation. The whole form is built around the idea of carrying on. There's always a next one. The credits roll, and then there's a little something, and the little something points at more to come. It's a structure that, at its core, is about reassurance. About the world not simply stopping. And there's a real comfort in that, especially late at night, especially when sleep is being slow to arrive. The comfort of familiar things that you know come back around. The reason so many people fall asleep to films and shows they've already seen 100 times is precisely this. The gentle reassurance of the known, the absence of any anxiety about what happens next because you already know what happens next. And going through these scenes has a similar quality to it. They're familiar. They come back. The pattern repeats, film after film, the meaty one, and then the silly one, the grin and the joke, the tease and the payoff, around and around, reliable as anything. You can lean on that repetition. You can let it carry you off. So if you've stayed with me all the way to here, and your eyes are heavy, and the room's gone soft and dim around you, I hope some of that has done its job. I hope walking slowly through all these little fragments, all these patient promises that there's always more coming, has been the kind of easy, undemanding company that lets a mind unclench and a body settle. There was nothing to solve tonight, nothing to keep up with, no tension to hold on to, just a long, gentle stroll through the margins of a very big story, told at the pace of someone who's in no hurry at all and would quite like you to drift off mid-sentence, if that's where the night is taking you. Here's a soft, low-stakes one to drift through, since we've got a bit more night left. Part of the fun of these scenes, over the years, was the gentle arguing they caused. Not angry arguing, just the pleasant, pointless sort of debate that fans have about the things they love. The kind that fills a car journey home, or a long thread between friends. There was the perennial question of what counts as a proper post-credit scene at all. Does a trailer bolted onto the end of a film count? The way a couple of these films did, treating a coming attractions reel as the stinger. Some people say absolutely not, that's a trailer, not a scene. Others say it played after the credits with intent, so it counts. There's no right answer, which is exactly why it's such a satisfying thing to disagree about. It'll never be settled, and nobody really wants it to be. There was the debate about whether the big finale's hammer-on-metal sound counts as a scene or not, which we've touched on, and which I land on the side of it counting in spirit even if not in fact, because the deliberate choice of it carries the same weight a scene would. But plenty of reasonable people disagree and insist that no visuals means no scene, full stop. Both positions are defensible. Both sides are, in their way, right, which is the most pleasant kind of argument to have. And there was endless, cheerful speculation about what the teases actually meant, who that grinning figure was before he was named, what the beacon from the rings was signalling to, who's really piloting that ship with the number on it. Whole evenings were lost to that sort of thing, friends spinning theories, most of them wrong, a few of them accidentally right, all of them enjoyable regardless of accuracy, because the joy was never really in being correct. The joy was in the wondering itself, in having a shared mystery to turn over together, in the gap between the tease and the payoff being a space you got to fill with your own ideas. I think that gap is the secret of the whole thing, honestly. A post-credit scene gives you just enough to spark the wondering and then deliberately stops, leaving the rest to you. And the time between scenes, the months or years before the next film, became this lovely, open field for imagination, for theories and arguments and quiet, private guesses. The scenes were generous that way. They didn't give you the answer. They gave you a question worth carrying around, and trusted you to enjoy carrying it. And a surprising amount of the pleasure of being a fan of all this lived in that carrying, in the wondering between the films, far more than in any single reveal. The reveals came and went. The wondering was constant, and constant company, and rather warm. Let me linger on one more small idea before we close, because it's a gentle one, and it fits the hour. There's a particular kind of person who always stays till the very end, through every last name, long after most of the room has emptied out. And over the years of these films, that person went from being an oddity to being, in many cinemas, the majority. I find that quiet shift truly lovely to think about, because staying till the end is, in its small way, an act of faith and patience combined. You're choosing to sit in a slowly emptying room, watching names you'll never read scroll past on the chance that there's something waiting for you at the bottom of it all. And most of the time there was, but even on the nights there wasn't, even after the big finale that gave you only a sound, there was something nice about having stayed anyway, about being the sort of person who sees a thing all the way through to its actual end, rather than slipping out when the interesting part appears to be over. And it changed the texture of those final minutes in a cinema. There used to be a scramble, everyone rushing for the exits, stepping over each other, the film already half forgotten. The post-credit scene turned them into something calmer, almost reflective. A few minutes of sitting still in the dim light, letting the film settle, names drifting by, a low hum of anticipation in the room. It gave you a moment to come down gently from whatever you'd just watched, rather than being flung straight back out into the bright, loud world. There's a kindness in that, accidental or not. A built-in pause, a bit of decompression before you have to go and find your car. I think about that sometimes. The way a small structural choice, deciding to put a little something at the end of the credits, quietly reshaped the behaviour of millions of people and gave them all a shared moment of stillness they didn't used to have. It's a tiny thing. It's also, in its way, rather a profound one. The scenes didn't just connect the films to each other. They gave the people watching a reason to slow down, to stay seated, to be patient together for a few minutes longer. And on a night like this one, when slowing down is the entire point, there's something fitting about ending on that. The whole tradition was underneath everything, an invitation to linger a little longer than you needed to, which is more or less what we've done together tonight. One last gentle wander before we close, and it's about the credits themselves, the actual scrolling names that all these scenes are buried inside of, because I think they deserve a moment too, and they're a soothing thing to think about at this hour. We've spent this whole evening talking about what comes after the credits, treating the credits as the obstacle, the long boring stretch you had to sit through to get to the good bit. But there's another way to think about it. All those names belong to real people. Hundreds and hundreds of them, on every single film. The ones who built the sets and sewed the costumes, and animated the creatures and arranged the music, and did the 1,000 invisible jobs that make a film exist at all. And the post-credits scene, by keeping people in their seats, by giving them a reason to sit there while those names go by, did something quietly decent. It made people stay and, whether they meant to or not, witness the scale of the effort, the sheer number of hands involved. I find that rather nice, actually, that the trick of the post-credits scene had this gentle side effect of holding an audience in place long enough to see just how many people it takes to make one of these things. You might not read any individual name, but you sit there and the names keep coming and keep coming, far more than you'd ever guess, and some part of you registers it. The enormity of the collaboration. The fact that the 2 hours of spectacle you just enjoyed rested on the patient work of a small town's worth of people, most of whom you'll never hear of. And there's something fitting about that, given everything we've said tonight about connection and continuity, and things being part of a larger whole. Because a film is itself exactly that, a vast connected effort, hundreds of separate contributions, all stitched into one thing, no single person able to see the whole of it, somehow adding up to something complete. The credits are the record of that, the proof of how many hands held the buckets in the long line. And the little scene at the bottom is the reward for sitting through the evidence of all that work, a small gift placed at the very end, for the people patient enough to stay through the proof of how the gift was made. So next time you find yourself sitting through a set of credits, waiting for whatever might be at the bottom, maybe let your eye rest on a few of the names as they pass. Somebody made every single thing you just watched. Somebody chose the colour of a wall, the shape of a prop, the precise weight of a moment of music. It's a quietly humbling thing to sit with, the scale of it, and a calm one, the kind of slow and grateful thought that suits a night winding down towards sleep. All those people, all that care. And then, at the very end, a little something waiting in the dark for you. We've come a long way tonight, all the way from a man waiting in the shadows of a mansion to a cloaked figure standing beside a child with a metal mask in his hand, and everything scattered in between. Dozens of tiny scenes, most of them shorter than a song, somehow adding up to this whole second story, told quietly at the edges of all, the louder ones. What stays with me, having walked through all of it, is how much of the charm lives in the contrast. The way the universe-shaking moments sit right next to the daft little throwaways, and somehow neither one diminishes the other. A pager on an empty street, and a cat coughing up a cube. A boy on a beach carrying his father's name, and a giant ant drumming away in an empty house. A villain turning to face the camera, and a man cursed to keep punching himself. The whole catalogue swings between those poles, dread and delight, and the swinging is the thing. It's what kept these scenes feeling alive rather than formulaic across all those years. You never quite knew, sitting there in the dark, which one you were about to get. And I keep coming back to the smaller ones in the end. The quiet meal, the hammer on metal and the silence after, the beach. They're the ones that linger once the spectacle fades. Maybe that's just me, and maybe it's the hour, but the scenes I find myself thinking about as I drift off aren't the big reveals. They're the gentle ones, the ones that weren't trying to make me gasp, just to make me feel something small and true, and then leave me alone with it. There's more coming, of course. There's always more coming with this lot. The pieces are being arranged again the way they were at the very start for another gathering somewhere down the line, and no doubt there'll be a fresh batch of these little scenes to go through when it arrives. New grins in the dark, new ships on the horizon, new jokes to send everyone home smiling. But that's a topic for another night, another long, quiet hour like this one, whenever it comes around. For now, though, we've reached the end of the credits, all of them, and there's nothing left to wait for, which on this particular night